So I have the pleasure to open this seminar online, organized by InsSciDE project with one of its major partner, UNESCO. We decided to organize this seminar in September in order to have some kind of distance with the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, we have no real distance because of the evolution of situation. But I think we will have during 2 days a very nice exchanges from different point of view about this crisis. I want to thank my co-organizer, Christina Burgi, and then Daniela Palmberg. It's now my privilege and my pleasure to welcome Maria Cristina Russo, the Director for International Cooperation for Research and Innovation at the European Commission. Madam, you have been supporting the InsSciDE project since its very beginning. Exchanging information and views with you has inspired us and gave us energy and forced us to be connected to reality. So thank you very much for joining us, and it's now your time to open the conference.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Professor Griset. Good morning to everybody. I'm really very pleased to open this webinar on science diplomacy and the cross-sectoral impact of COVID-19. Again, I would like to thank Professor Griset for the invitation and also for his work, for the coordination of the work that he and his team have done in the framework of the EU Horizon 2020 funded project on inventing a shared science diplomacy for Europe, the InsSciDE project. Now, I think that when this project started some time ago, we would not even think that we would find ourselves in this situation. We all knew that science diplomacy was important, was essential, I would say, and we have supported this project through our Horizon Europe program, but nobody would have thought that we would have this webinar online, that we would cope with the situation whereby, I mean, the pandemic has shaped any kind of way we used to work, we used to live, and has made us think again on the role of science diplomacy in all that. So I will not speak a lot on science diplomacy because you are the experts on that. I am the one that puts it in action, and the discussion will take place later. But what I would like to say is that of course, science diplomacy is very important for us. We have a communication, which when we say communication, it's the formal commission documents in which we announce our policies. The communication which is on which the international cooperation, research and innovation policy is based dates back now from 2012, and science diplomacy is one of the key elements in our action. It has been then, therefore, a key element in the Horizon 2020 program, not only through single projects, but also throughout the action that we have carried out within the program. And I don't have now the time to explain the different activities, but I'm sure you have seen and studied them through in your project. And also science diplomacy will be a key element of the renewed strategy for international cooperation in research and innovation, on which we are working and that we will formalize soon. I would like to say also that with this new commission, I don't know if I can say new still, because now it's almost 1 year, but the impetus that was given by President van der Leyen to the European Commission in many areas includes also the areas of science diplomacy, because one of the aim of the President is to make Europe a stronger global actor and to have the EU playing a stronger role in geopolitical terms. And within this context, science diplomacy is really very important. Now, as I said, the question which is really important is the cross-sectoral impact of COVID-19. And it cannot be more timely for me because yesterday I had the honor and pleasure to moderate an important international debate within the R&I Days, the Research and Innovation Days, which are currently taking place here in Brussels, and although we are connected with all over the world, on the theme global challenges need global responses. I had the honor to have Keith Pierce, the director from the NSF in the United States, the Assistant Director General of UNESCO, the Executive Director from the EDCTP, the European and Developing Countries Clinical Trials Partnership, and many other stakeholders participated. And in fact, one of the main highlights of this discussion was that the pandemic has further strengthened the need to cooperate and to create partnerships on research and innovation. And those partnerships are very important not only for the advancement of science, but for the connection of people, for people to be connected to our people and countries through our sciences working together. One of the questions that was discussed was the impact, for example, of the withdrawal of the US from the WHO or UNESCO. And I was very pleased to listen to the director of the National Science Foundation saying that this does not imply at all. On the contrary, even more, they want to cooperate. The scientists have to get together, have to cooperate, have to put together the forces in order to face this important challenge that we're living, and be ready also for future challenges. So in fact, turning this challenge into an opportunity. And what better example of science diplomacy? I mean, science diplomacy can really help in all that. So with those words, I would like to also thank you, Professor Griset, all the other institutes that have been working with you on the InsSciDE project, including the work that you're doing with this webinar, because all that will be very important for us in order to feed in shaping the policy agenda for the coming years. You know that we are about launching the next research and innovation framework program, Horizon Europe, which will have a very strong international cooperation dimension, in which science diplomacy will play a very important role. And we look forward to the output of this seminar, the output of your work, in order to support us in our work. So with those words, I would like to thank you very much for your attention and wish you a very fruitful and rich discussion. Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous, Madame la Directrice. Thank you for this kind introduction. Yes, we are connected to Innovation Days. I know that you were engaged in this main event for European Union. I have to add that we are writing in the process of InsSciDE a policy brief about health diplomacy for Europe. So I hope that you will find some interest reading this paper, and we will continue in a good connection with our sister project S4D4C to feed, I hope, the future project of EU in science diplomacy. So thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you for all the participants. Also, we have a lot of very important people in this webinar. They are going to exchange ideas. And firstly, a special thanks to Jan Melissen and the Hague Journal of Diplomacy for joining us. They are not part of the InsSciDE project, but maybe they will they will find interest to work with us in the future. So thank you, Jan. You are in charge of the first panel in this webinar. So I transmit you the lead for this very nice panel. And thank you at PIERRE-BRUNO RUFFINI for organizing with you this nice panel. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much, Pascal. Dear colleagues, friends in the profession, and ladies and gentlemen, everybody watching and listening, welcome to this webinar panel discussion. So my name is Jan Melissen. I'm editor-in-chief of the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, and it was a fantastic pleasure to work with my colleague PIERRE-BRUNO RUFFINI on this forum discussion on science diplomacy, and that is coming together here also online, and not just as printed essays, but in a discussion where we try to build on our understanding so far of science diplomacy. I was really pleased to have the 7 essays in this collection that actually give a very nice view of the spectrum of a discussion on science diplomacy. And if I may, if you allow me to say it in a slightly provocative way, ranging from the true believers to the true skeptics and everything in between, academics and also practitioners. And I believe that particularly at this point, with as PIERRE-BRUNO once said in a conversation, he said, Jan, with COVID-19, we have the ultimate stress test of science diplomacy. This is a really good moment. And of course, science diplomacy has been around for almost since time immemorial, but also in our contemporary period for a long time. But now everybody, I think, understands in a much deeper way the importance of the different nexus, the difficult and complex nexus between science and diplomacy that we try to thresh out. So it's a time to be passionate about science diplomacy. I think it's also a time to be dispassionate about science diplomacy, to keep the head cool, to see what the opportunities are, but also to see the obstacles and how science diplomacy is meandering between collaboration and competition. Competitive collaboration may be a nice label to sort of capture the field. So the 3 questions that we will deal with first is, who are the practitioners? Often in these kind of webinars, academics particularly can discuss ages about definitions and concepts, but a nice angle is actually, who are doing this? Who are the practitioners? Secondly, what has been achieved? It's the mother of all questions on science diplomacy. So what can it deliver? And it's hard to unearth that, but I think also good to have an understanding of the context, the political contexts in which science diplomacy unfolds, as we can see, for instance, good from historical case studies. Thirdly, a fresh look, widening the perspective and looking critically, also trying to involve others in a debate that is sometimes a bit centered on a debate that is a bit centered around a limited number of participants. So with that, I would like to start with our first panel on practitioners. And we have 3 guests. First of all, that's Paul BERKMAN, although I cannot see Paul on my small screen, but I will introduce him. Anyway, Paul BERKMAN is director of the Science Diplomacy Center at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Secondly, we have Lorenzo Melchor, who is at the Spanish Foundation for Science and Technology. Welcome, Lorenzo. And as you can see in the journal, Lorenzo has a spectacularly diverse CV. So great to have you with all that experience on board as a scholar, as a practitioner. And thirdly, from the University of Maryland, College Park, Karen Lips. Hello, Karen. Also a very warm welcome to have you on board here. So I would like to, without further ado, go into this panel. We proceed as follows. Each of the speakers has 5 minutes, and after the 3 presentations, we would like to involve the other participants to the webinar as well, to have to open up this discussion. So since I'm not seeing Paul on my screen, but I'm working with a 13-inch screen this afternoon, Paul, are you with us? And could I give you the floor, please? I see Paul is not here. And then, so we proceed with Lorenzo.
Sorry, Jan, Paul is here. He has written in the chat.
Ah, he's written in the chat. Okay. I'll just go to the chat and see I'm here. Paul, could you please switch on your microphone? Right. I'm not one of the speakers. Well, the idea was actually, Paul, that Paul.
Great.
Yeah, there you are.
We have motion. Excellent.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you with a spectacular background. I would like to borrow that one, and the one from Pascal as well, by the way. So it's wonderful to have you here. I hope that you have been part of the introduction of the panel. So we're now in the first round where we have three practitioners speaking, of which you're the first one. I've already introduced you as director of the new Science Diplomacy Center at Tufts. And it would be wonderful to hear your 5-minute take on the subject before we move on to Lorenzo and Karen. The floor is yours, Paul.
Thank you very much, Jan. Before beginning, I'd like to thank PIERRE-BRUNO particularly for the invitation to contribute to the forum edition. I'd also like to thank Pascal Crisset for including me in this discussion, and for the excellent meeting that we had in Moscow, and also with Rasmus Bertelsen. Jan, I thank you from the Hague Journal, and there's more in this. Since I'm transatlantic, I'd also like to acknowledge Tim FLINK somewhere in the background from the S4D4C, recognizing this as a European Commission Horizon 2020 collaboration, and also UNESCO. UNESCO opened this, and UNESCO is involved in an important activity with open science. So kudos to UNESCO. For me, the journey with science diplomacy began in the background, literally in Antarctica when I was 22. I spent a year scuba diving under the ice in that McMurdo Sound area that you see. It was like walking off the earth for a year with tremendous perspective of the world we live in. And one of the questions that I began asking when I was 22 is what enabled the United States and the Soviet Union to cooperate continuously in Antarctica as well as outer space throughout the Cold War, despite the animosities that isolated them in every other sphere during that period. So what was special about the Antarctic and outer space? And that led me to the Antarctic Treaty. And the Antarctic Treaty was built on common interests, the starting point for the dialogue between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1959, the height of the Cold War, a decade after World War II, the first use of nuclear weapons. The Antarctic Treaty became the first nuclear arms agreement. And so from that point forward, and I began teaching about Antarctic science and policy connections the following year as a visiting professor. So for me, this has been a lifelong journey, not only as an academic, living in the academic world, but thinking in practical terms. How do you actually apply science diplomacy for the benefit of all on Earth across generations? So that's been my journey. There's a slide that I sent to you, Jan. If you could show that for a second, that would be great. And I'll continue to talk. But in this journey, one of the observations from the Antarctic Treaty experience is that the starting point determines the journey. So if you start from a position of conflict, the journey is filled with conflict. And much of the dialogue in the world we face today is starting with conflict. If, on the other hand, you start with common interests, the journey is filled with cooperation. Both common interest building, next slide, just press the button, please. Yes. The journey starts with security timescales in terms of risks of political, economic, societal, environmental instabilities, any security dialogue. At the same time, we have urgencies that operate across generations, which is one of the considerations we're facing today. We have an issue of survival on a planetary scale. Next slide, please. If you just push the button. In any case, under security timescales is the concept of conflict resolution. At the timescale of sustainability, the challenge is common interest building. And one of the lessons that emerged from World War II was that this thinking isn't at a single moment. The thinking is across a continuum of urgency. So before World War II ended, There were discussions in Bretton Woods and in San Francisco that led to the International Monetary Fund, that led to the Charter of the United Nations. Those elements were discussed before the end of World War II. After World War II, those elements were implemented. And so the challenge is to think across a continuum of urgencies and to make informed decisions. And an informed decision operates across a continuum of urgency. So the challenge is to think short-term to long-term. We're in the middle of a pandemic right now, exponential growth of the pandemic. We see it in every newspaper and every day, and in terms of exponential growth. We have 8 billion people on Earth, 36 million cases today. So we still have a long way to go. And the challenge is to think before the inflection point. How do we build a world that will work for future generations after the inflection point? So that the challenge in terms of operating across the pandemic is not just the moment. It's through the inflection point to the logistic part of the curve when the impact begins to decelerate. And so the challenge is to operate across a continuum of urgencies from security timescales to sustainability timescales that operate across generations. And the two negotiating strategies that are involved, one end is conflict resolution. And conflict resolution is what is well worn and what we see in terms of gloom and doom every day of the week. On the other hand, the experience from the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War, where they cooperated, the starting point was common interests. And one of the things that's similar that the Secretary General of the United Nations noted, we're going through a moment right now unlike any since World War II. And the reason, in part, one of the metrics is that there is a sense of survival at local to global scales. Each of us as individuals, as a community of individuals, has a sense of survival at local to global scales. Last time that happened was World War II. In effect, we have a common interest as a civilization today on a planetary scale about survival. There is opportunity to use that momentum to look forward through the inflection point until after the inflection point. My only 5-minute intent here was to share the concept of operating short-term to long-term. There are lots of elements about science diplomacy to discuss, but in 5 minutes to be practical and to think in terms of building connections that partnerships, as was just discussed, it requires thinking across time, short-term to long-term. These relationships that are intended are not transitory. They're permanent relationships. They're at the scale of our globally interconnected civilization. And so I appreciate the opportunity to share these comments, truly. And I have great respect for the European Commission and for the science diplomacy projects that are emerging, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be on this panel with colleagues. Truly, I think science diplomacy is a tool, an international, interdisciplinary, and inclusive tool for the benefit of all on Earth across generations. So with that, I wish everybody good health.
Thank you so much, Paul, for these wonderful scene-setting remarks. And indeed, one idea of a definition already coming out: science diplomacy is a tool. We will see more perspectives on that. I think your time scale argument is indeed very, very fundamental and deserves more than 5 minutes. But in the start of this seminar, that is all we have. With that, we move to Lorenzo, and Lorenzo's piece in the Hague Journal of Diplomacy Forum, I think is a recommended reader for aspiring science diplomats, because the fundamental question he's answering there is, what is a science diplomat? As we can already gather from the observations by Paul BERKMAN, those can be people inside governments, inside foreign ministries, or outside. And it's a world of different mindsets coming together. So Lorenzo, I'd like to hand over to you here. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Jan, and thank you also to PIERRE-BRUNO, RUFFINI, who put together this fantastic series of articles and pieces for the Hague Journal of Diplomacy. Thanks also to UNESCO and InsSciDE for putting together this fabulous symposium on science diplomacy. So I'm going to share my screen because I have a set of slides to show you. And exactly this section is going to try to answer to this interesting question. Who are the science diplomacy practitioners? And in fact, this is the piece that Jan was referring to. What is a science diplomat? I was honored to receive this invitation by PIERRE-BRUNO to explain a little bit the different science diplomat figures that are out there, and also to explain a little bit my experience working at the Spanish Embassy in London from 2015 to 2018. So this is a practitioner's piece, and in the definition that I attempt to put forward is this one. Science diplomats are to be considered all those professionals, be they scientists or diplomats, who work to place science, technology, and innovation affairs as an important dimension within international relations and the international policy system. Of course, this definition may be very wide, but during the article, I try to establish certain subdivisions or subcategories to this wide definition. It's true that Daryl Coughlin or William Mumo some years ago introduced the concept of the diplomat scientists, those scientists who are appointed as advisors to ministries of foreign affairs or who engage in international discussions to solve international crises such as COVID-19 or other type of figures of scientists who are playing a diplomatic role. But also we have the scientist diplomat, those diplomats that are specialized in liaising with science, technology, and innovation affairs. A third figure that must be also considered is those of the additional mediators. These may be policy analysts, international relationship officers, science attachés or science advisors who aren't career scientists or career diplomats and such. So thanks to this wide definition, I tried to do the science diplomat taxonomy by distinguishing two different categories. The one about institutionalized positions, all those roles that national governments or international organizations allocate to certain embassies, permanent representations, ministries, government departments, and so forth. In here, we have figures such as the science counselors and attachés, innovation attachés, science envoys, tech ambassadors, etc. But also we may consider special ambassadors for science diplomacy, chief science advisors, or the wide variety of civil servants, officers, and managers who are working in these governments to advance science diplomacy activities. But science diplomacy goes beyond the traditional role of the state. We must also consider non-institutionalized positions there in research centers and academia, in private industry and non-governmental organizations, and also other governmental departments that don't have a proper science diplomacy mandate, but that may sporadically be playing a role in the international policy system by trying to embed more science, technology, and innovation affairs in there. In here, only sometimes researchers in academia or industry, policy scientists, and a wide variety of additional roles may be engaging in this collective science diplomacy endeavor. In the piece, I also introduced the Science Diplomat's Toolbox. Depending on your background, whether you have been trained as a scientist or as a diplomat, you will have certain set of skills and knowledges are already acquired, but you will need to nurture an additional set of skills to operate in this interface between science and diplomacy. For instance, you need to be aware of how the national and international science policy system operate, but also how international politics and international law is working. in set of skills, well, you will need to be able to communicate and narrate stories and writing skills for all kinds of audiences. You will need to have some scientific literacy and scientific credibility and ability to harness scientific knowledge and networks. But these are just some of the tools included in this toolbox. There are many other additional references that may expand on this toolbox. But the importance here is that even if you are a scientist or if you are a diplomat, you need to develop certain skills to operate in this interface. And lastly, and based on my experience at the Spanish Embassy in London, I provide in this piece a set of challenges and recommendations. I here only refer to 4 out of them. One is that in science diplomacy, there isn't a clear career path. Every government, every institution has their own specific science diplomacy roles, and they may not refer to them as science diplomacy job. They may be referred as science attaché, as international relations officer, and such. So you need to be creative and engage with potential mentors and policy environments to understand how certain institutions and governments have this governance framework of science diplomacy. Second, as I said already before, additional training and experience is required to operate in this interface. Third, even if you operate in here and you are a scientist, bear in mind that science is just one piece in the puzzle. And your role is trying to make this piece more important. But there you are competing against other different interests, from political interests, economic interests, trade, and many other aspects of life. So the decision will end up being down to diplomats or policymakers, but you need to increase your persuasion skills to make science more important in that role. And lastly, communication and networking skills. I cannot but emphasize that you need to nurture these skills. So thanks for listening to me and for giving me this opportunity. And also I would like to send my gratitude to my colleagues in the Spanish Foundation for Science and Technology, Izaskun Lacunza and Ana Elorza, and also to all civil servants, diplomats and officers who worked together with me at the Spanish Embassy in London during my term there.
Muchas gracias, Lorenzo. So that is indeed a very valuable structuring exercise that you have done, and which I should not forget to mention and perhaps repeat. Like all the other essays, is now this week and through the weekend open, accessible for everybody. So everybody interested in this piece and other pieces can download it. As you rightly observed, and as also comparative analysis shows, there is not one way of doing science diplomacy, which is what's wonderful when you look at different countries' practices. So there is not somewhere on the shelf an idea of how you practice science diplomacy, which makes this such a burgeoning field. Burgeoning field, I think, also for new generations. I lecture on science diplomacy as well myself, and I noticed that there is an enormous passion among new generations to enter this field. And so I think this forum and the recent literature will be a stepping stone for others to build on. Thirdly, and I would personally welcome that very much. Thirdly, you've entered the term network, Lorenzo, and with that I would like to hand over to Karen Lips, where indeed another way of defining science diplomacy might be to see it as a bundle of practices where many actors have interests, and we also have to reflect on the role of academia. So with that, Karen, I would like to hand over to you, please.
Thank you very much. On behalf of my co-authors, Dr. Meredith Gore and Liz Nichols, I'd like to thank Dr. Ruffini, Dr. MELISSEN, and all the organizers for inviting us to join this panel and participate in the discussion, as well as in the special series in the journal as well. It was great to be able to follow Lorenzo because our paper pretty much focuses on the academic experience. The three of us are all American academics who have taught for many years at US universities. And our perspective then comes from a period of time where, after teaching for many years, we all spent fellowships at the US Department of State. And so professionally, our background is in working internationally on issues related to biodiversity loss and extinction, emerging infectious diseases, wildlife trafficking, and tropical deforestation. And we met, as I said, when we were serving in two different fellowship programs, the Jefferson Science Fellowship Program and the AAAS Science, Technology, and Policy Fellowship Program, where both these programs put academics into the US government for a short period of time. And so you come in, you leave then with the experience both of an academic and a short-term experience as working in diplomacy. And the paper we contributed then really came out of this joint experience of working as researchers internationally and teachers and professors, as well as spending time working for our government. And so we compared our notes and recognized that the incredible amount of knowledge we gained serving as fellows on international science policy, but especially we noted that we had learned quite a bit about the process of science policy. And so policy relevant evidence-based science is desperately needed to respond to, as many have said, these global problems such as the COVID pandemic, or those related to the environment, human health, technology and computing, national security, and international affairs. These problems are complex, they're synergistic, and effective solutions are going to require collaborations internationally among policymakers, diplomats, and scientists from multiple disciplines, working across geopolitical boundaries, and at multiple levels of governance. Successful collaborations will depend on a problem-solving mentality and boundary-spanning individuals who share vocabulary, values, and practices with academic scientists, diplomats, and policy practitioners. Boundary-spanning scientists understand and appreciate the values and cultures of policymakers, practice effective communication skills, and have adapted to function in the science policy ecosystem. Yet few universities here in the US adequately prepare students or faculty to operate in these spaces, and thus most academic scientists lack training in the policy process and lack experience in collaborating with practitioners or policymakers. This limits the academic experience and career options of students, restricts the research impact of scientists, hampers science policy interactions, and minimizes public engagement of universities and their faculty. Even for those with science policy experience, institutional barriers in the academy may hinder scientists from participating in the policymaking process. And this produces a problematic boundary between academic scholarship and its use by diplomats and policy practitioners. And so we saw a disconnect between the content taught in higher education, the process of scientific research, and what engagement in science diplomacy and science policy involves. As a result, the current system here exposes students to a case of double jeopardy, where universities prepare students for traditional academic careers that only a small fraction will achieve, and simultaneously limits their exposure to the courses and experiences that would prepare them to work across a range of science policy spaces that are desperately needed. We must change how scientists teach, research, and engage with diplomats, policy, and policymakers if we are to produce graduates who can address global problems. Getting to the world we want will require institutionalizing multi-directional exchanges among science, policy, and diplomacy to promote a healthier exchange between universities and society. We should capitalize on the opportunities created by the current pandemics and address student needs for diverse professional skills and growing demands that higher education show evidence of the societal values of college degrees. The COVID pandemic has already begun to strain institutional budgets and generate conversation about the future of academic institutions. As we look towards what elements to maintain, rethink, and rebuild, the time has never been more opportune for academia to reflect on more intentional engagement with the world outside the ivory tower. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Karen, raising important questions on how to enhance the capacity of science policy and science diplomacy, how to create in a siloed academic world the kind of boundary spanners that are needed out there. And indeed, as I think it would be grist to the mill of our students to hear, well, you need a lot of non-academic skills and competences, even writing, to survive out there. We should not be creating a world of academics whilst most of them go on to other professions. A particular thanks also to Karen and her co-authors for their patience, because they actually submitted an article to the Hague Journal of Diplomacy before the idea of the forum came up. So that's how this came all wonderfully together. Let me please also take this occasion to mention for all of you watching and listening outside of the panel, please put your questions in the Q&A box, which Daniela Palmberg will pick up at the end of our session. So here, what I would like to do, and we are on Zoom, so we have a bit of an old-fashioned hand raise system. It's not like in Teams with a little red hand, but you actually have to raise physically your hand. I would like to draw in other panelists in this discussion in the remaining time that we have, which is not very long. I would have questions myself, but I'd love to give the floor to any of the other participants. Whom can I give the floor, please? PIERRE-BRUNO, yes, please go ahead. Please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry.
Do it again. Yeah. No. You're still on mute.
I'm sorry. That's okay.
Now you're okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you, Jan. This is a question to Lorenzo. Obviously, the most challenging aspect of what is a science diplomat is about non-official or non-institutionalized, as you say, science diplomat. What I notice in that is that at university, at research institutes, science diplomacy is still poorly known. You know, if you ask colleagues, if you ask people about science diplomacy, they would say, "What is it about? We don't know about that." And but I understand from your presentation that there could well be at the university or at research institutes people that are engaged in science diplomacy without knowing it. You know, non-officially, of course, but even without realizing that they are acting as science diplomat. Do you agree with that, or what kind of actions would those ignoring themselves science diplomats do?
Thank you, PIERRE-BRUNO, for that question. And I would like also to reflect on something that Karen and her colleagues mentioned in the paper, the need to increase the amount of knowledge exchange opportunities between research and academia and policy-making processes. So in fact, we in S44C have published very recently a policy report calling for a systemic change in the way how different stakeholders are getting involved in science diplomacy. And we believe that institutions such as research centers and universities should reinforce or should get strengthened in the sense that they should have a proper public policy unit or international relationship unit with proper staff to be able to engage the research center and university at a global scale or at the policy-making process at the different governance level scale. At the moment, this process is done. transparent as we would like it to be, but certain countries has universities with established units for these matters. And there are universities that are liaising directly with the United Nations to raise the profile of the SDGs, for instance. So I would do two things. One, strengthening those units with professionals to do that. And secondly, raising awareness about science diplomacy and science advice in policy making for career scientists and researchers to be aware that they can develop these activities.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. Anybody else would like? I see Tim flicking on his camera. So, the floor is yours.
One question or discussion point to Lorenzo also, and maybe a small one to Paul. Lorenzo, one of the things that strikes me whenever we discuss the question, what is a science diplomat, also within our project, is that we always think of self-descriptions, so about people who self-describe themselves as either or course, because in some cases people are described or ascribed, although we might think of them as, you know, pure scientists engaging in international relations, or as members of FECYT or the German Research Foundation or the German Academic Exchange Service and NWO in the Netherlands and the like. But this course somehow frames them now as science diplomats. How do we go about that? Second question to Paul, and maybe this is more of a comment. Paul, you said that, you know, there's been a Cold War period with a bipolar world that somehow ends in the 1990s, and now it's all about finding solutions to collective action problems again. I'd rather doubt whether the Cold War period is over, or I would challenge that we would find ourselves now in a situation where everybody is aware of, you know, exigent times that we face regarding the Arctic and the like. So at the moment, don't we see new geopolitics on the rise, with China, with Russia starkening again, with other autocratic countries, which again brings that old necessity for science diplomacy back on the table that we thought we would have already supermounted. Thank you.
Okay,
so I like your question, Tim.
Thank you very much, Tim. Could I just, indeed, Paul, if you go first and then we go to Lorenzo, could I both ask you, in the interests of time management, to keep your answers brief? Thank you. Paul, you go first.
So the question of geopolitics is part of the reason for science diplomacy. The problems with geopolitics are paralyzing. So the question of a diplomat in a general sense is an individual that navigates the politics independent of allies or adversaries. And so in that sense, the challenge that we face today is the same as it was before, to navigate those problems. I think that the science component is, there's a research element. The diplomat component is an action component involving decisions for governance mechanisms and built infrastructure, and their coupling to achieve progress with sustainability. So science diplomat, in that sense, is traversing the research and the action component to contribute to informed decisions. And just in a closing comment, Jan, if I might, we have a responsibility. That's the challenge. We have a responsibility, even if we're in academics and writing about it, we have a responsibility. The education component that Karen talked about is spot on, but we have a responsibility to think across time for the benefit of all on Earth. It's not, we can't abrogate that responsibility just to the leaders of institutions. And that's part of the challenge. As Lorenzo pointed, it's not only people with positions. There are others that are contributing to the welfare of all on earth. And that is an empowering component. And that's something indeed that next generation should be encouraged to follow and pursue.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that. And I would to the societal political relevance. So over to you, Lorenzo.
Thanks, Tim, for your comment. Well, I think the question remains at what is science diplomacy? And you know that science diplomacy has become like an umbrella term that involves many different practices, approaches, and such. So what is a science diplomat? In my description, what I attempt to do is putting together all different job roles that are perceived as a career scientist, as a career diplomat, as an active researcher, or as a policy officer, and who may be related somehow to science diplomacy. But of course, the way they are perceived, I guess science diplomat, or being a science diplomat, is if you wear a hat at certain moments in your professional life.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And all of you, I would like to invite you to come back in the following panels. Just raise your hand if you want to make any points there. We then move on to the second slot. And in the second slot, we get a little bit more of an academic perspective, which I personally think is very, very important, because it already starts with what is the question, what is science diplomacy? And as you can see in Tim Flink's blog on the website of the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, hosted by Leiden University, you can start quite a discussion about that already, the basic point of what it is we are talking about. Now, as I perceive the field, and with my limited view of what's going on, is that there is a great need, and that's where we have with our two next speakers. I think come of the National Research University Higher School of Economics in Moscow. I have to look at my paper because I know you from Seoul in South Korea. And now you're in Russia. Welcome, Olga. Olga is going to talk about case studies from the Cold War. I personally believe that case studies are absolutely fundamental to unearth what I call the mother of all questions: what can science diplomacy contribute? But also, sometimes when we are carried away by our passions and our ideals, we need to have this very cold look at political context and political interests. I think that are so clearly shown through historical case studies. Next, we have PIERRE-BRUNO Ruffini, who's already been identified as the great hero of this project, the man pulling everybody together. PIERRE-BRUNO is a professor at the University of Le Havre, and of course, the guest editor here. So, Olga, I'm looking forward to your 5 minutes take on what we can learn from collaboration between the United States and then Soviet Union.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jan, and thank you very much, PIERRE-BRUNO, for this opportunity. I'm happy to contribute, and I'm happy to be part of this wonderful panel. So, in my essay, and actually in my research, I'm focusing on the Cold War experience. And I look at the Cold War experience as actually cooperation between two superpowers, because despite all this narrative of hostilities and tensions and everything, we actually see some good outcomes. Not all the time those outcomes can be interpreted from a good perspective, but something good definitely can be found. For example, something related to human rights or arms control or environmental impact and protection, and even vaccine diplomacy. Those issues were discussed, and we should understand those issues were discussed not just only between diplomats, but with assistants and with talks with scientists who actually who knew the issue. And my focus it's less there will be an agreement, and something goes with Paul and his approach to this Cold War experience and cooperation between two superpowers. And this agreement, which actually enabled people-to-people exchanges between two superpowers. But those exchanges, they were specific. And my focus is academic and technical exchanges. It means starting from 1958, the era of academic and technical exchanges began. And actually, because of this agreement, Lesser-Rubin agreement was an international agreement, and it was supervised by diplomatic representatives, and it was uninterrupted for the decades. And actually, by the end of the Cold War and Soviet Union dissolution. So what's important from this agreement, and what I would like to focus on, I would like to focus on this human dimension, of this humanistic perspective, because it's not just only about cooperation, it's not just only about making some teams. And actually, not all the time it was the case for scientists and academics. Actually, it was about communication. It was communication, it's about this people-to-people interaction. And because through interpersonal interaction, it was possible to understand intentions of the other side. And it was possible to maybe even improve relations. And I would like to maybe paraphrase Jack Matlock. It's an ambassador to Moscow, and I had a pleasure to work with his archive, his magnificent archive materials. And he was saying that this human dimension actually really important, because when people are making decisions, on diplomats as well, of course, they keep in mind so how those decisions would impact not just only, or maybe not just only to promote interests of their country, but how those decisions impact the people in the other country. Maybe it's a little bit idealistic view, but actually this idealistic view was not so far away from reality, because again, like 30 years of this constant interaction. But again, it was not the people, like random people, it was academics and scientists and specialists. It was special people. And in decision-making, the perspective just given by these people, Americans in the Soviet Union or Soviet Russian people in America, it was actually considered. Again, it sounds maybe a little bit naive and idealistic, but as Jack Matlock, from his experience, and I'm not just only referencing to him, it was obvious. So this humanistic dimension, it was considered. So this personal contact impacted human mind, and because of this, maybe not because of this, we cannot say definitely it was the reason of all this, maybe like a positive outcomes of cooperation during the Cold War, but we cannot exclude this human dimension. Nonetheless, what would be the outcome, and what would be delivery? It would be, Jan, your own question. What is the delivery of science diplomacy? Well, we know the Cold War did not become a conventional war. The period of time was, of course, very complicated, but anyway, it was managed diplomatically, and of course with involvement of academics, specialists, scientists, anyone who actually contributed positively to actual good relations between two superpowers, so despite some propaganda issues and everything. So I will finish here. I think it's time, and I will be happy to answer some questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Olga. I would recommend anybody to read also your piece, which is a piece of very good historical work and showing the importance of that historical research. And it's interesting that in your presentation you emphasize the human dimension. At the time, 1958, we're talking about just after the launching of Sputnik, the sort of Cold War frame of mind that dictated how the superpowers saw one another. And then there is this human science and human undercurrent. So I think that's really the value also of your work. In early discussions with PIERRE-BRUNO about this forum, one point came back all the time, and that was, well, we would now like to do not just another forum, not going around in circles, but try to build on what people have written and said about this before. And that is also where your own work comes in, looking at, could I call it dialectic, or at least these two dimensions on a continuum of collaboration and competition. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jan. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to guest edit the forum in your Hague Journal of Diplomacy. And of course, thank you to all our contributors. I'm happy also that this forum could be a part of the webinar series organized by the InsSciDE project. I would like to present a critical reflection on how most people talk about science diplomacy and how it is most often described. I note as a starting point that the definitions, taxonomies, concepts, discourses have been produced by practitioners. Practitioners have built the dominant or mainstream vision of science diplomacy. But I am struck by this. There is a gap between the practices and the concept of science diplomacy as it is conveyed in this practitioner-driven literature. In a word, practices of science diplomacy are broader than what the narratives choose to highlight. I try to describe and explain this gap. In the dominant or mainstream vision, the essence of science diplomacy is to help reducing political tensions between countries, to improve mutual understanding between peoples, and more broadly, to work towards the satisfaction of common interests. To achieve this, two sets of tools are very central. International scientific cooperation is one. Bringing sound scientific knowledge into policy making, in particular with regard to global issues, is the other one. It follows that science diplomacy is described as a virtuous process in which scientists can act as middlemen in peace building. They can work for the common good and bring about a better international order. This is a nice and appealing vision of science diplomacy on which everybody can agree. So do I. But does it tell the whole story? The answer is no. It's driven by national interests. In conclusion, from a scholarly perspective, I think that the discourse on science diplomacy needs to be reframed. The need is to provide an understanding of science diplomacy that would fully acknowledge its dual nature, both collaborative and competitive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, PIERRE-BRUNO, for this crystal clear presentation, making a very fundamental point, also for newcomers to the field. And I can also second what you are saying by some of my students who have read the literature on science diplomacy say, well, they're coming across the same kinds of arguments. So there is indeed the important task how to build on that, indeed also departing from observing the practices and looking for ways to engage theoretically with the fascinatingly important pressing subject of science diplomacy. So here I would like to call upon the other panelists, people who have not spoken yet or people who have already spoken, to enter this discussion. Please, by just flicking on your camera and raising your hand. Paul, you go first.
So I have a question for PIERRE-BRUNO. PIERRE-BRUNO, you indicated the notion of competing interests of states and the framing of science diplomacy from the perspectives of diplomats or scientists who may not ever have had a diplomatic position. I wonder, in terms of whether it's called science diplomacy or anything else, whether the journey that we're involved with is one of articulating what the fundamental challenges are that we face as a globally interconnected civilization. So the challenge you identified in terms of nations competing with each other, the alternative to nations competing with each other is common interest on a planetary scale. And if you take the Earth just as a single entity, 30% of the Earth falls within the boundaries of nations. historically, currently. 70% of the Earth falls beyond the boundaries of nations under international law. On a planetary scale, geographically, the challenge is to balance national interests and common interests. And so I wonder, in terms of whether the definition is the issue. The issue is responsibility. How do we manage a globally interconnected civilization? And I would argue we're just in our infancy. The 20th century was the first time we ever had world wars in the history of humankind, in 60 centuries of calendars. 1 century out of 60 is like an infant in a lifespan of 60 years. We're just in our infancy. How do we look forward across centuries for the survival of our species?
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for making that point very well. Over to you, Pierre-Bruno.
Paul, what you say illustrates quite well that you are a practitioner, a science diplomat, and that I am not a science diplomat, or not anymore. I agree with you. The main question, the main practical political question is to address in the best possible way the global challenges, COVID-19 and others. I agree with that. Well, but you know, what I draw from my experience at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of my country, I was working in bilateral relations, you see, not working on global challenges. And I could understand that what science diplomacy could mean at that time. Science diplomacy was the emerging topic 10 years ago. I could understand that there was, or there is, a part of science diplomacy which is national, you see, which is not directly aiming at solving global challenges. Whatever I can think, as you do, about the relevance of trying to fight as best as possible to address common challenges. So my point as a scholar is, sorry about that, maybe to understand or to ask myself if the definitions are relevant or sufficient. My answer is no. We have to understand that aspect of science diplomacy, which is not connected to global challenges, which is more connected to national interests as such. And of course, both coexist. You know, science diplomacy is not white, it's not dark, it's gray, as everything is life. There is a mix, you know, of national interest and common interest. And my point is to, well, maybe lead people to understand the complexity of the landscape from a scholarly perspective and not from an operational or practical perspective.
So just following on, if I might, for a second, Jan, in terms of the scholarly perspective, nations are the central jurisdictional unit. After nations bumped into each other, we created international with the League of Nations and the United Nations. In a globally interconnected civilization, we also have subnational. Cities, C40, are talking about climate, for example. So in a sense, the challenge of common interests is subnational, national, and international. And the challenge is how we work together on a civilization scale across the earth.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, for that. I can imagine that these tensions are coming back, are felt also by individual diplomats and science diplomats who've always sort of veered between serving the prince and serving the peace, being there for the raison d'etat and the raison de système. So it's coming, I think it's coming back in many ways. I was wondering, well, no, I'm going over to Olga because I see Olga's hand is up.
Yes, very quick comment. Even in my talk, I focused a little bit different things, but we share the point of view with Pierre-Bruno, and so we have to admit. So we live in nation states, and nation states are not going to disappear anytime soon. And every nation state promotes its national interests and just try to provide its own security in many different dimensions, and we just cannot ignore this. And it's a reality from maybe realistic diplomatic point of view in international relations. National interests, they come first until the world will be collapsed or anything. So in this case, we just have to take it as is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. As far as I'm concerned, the jury is still out on these questions, but it's good to have flagged them here, and we need many others to pick them up. So much is clear from this discussion that the circle of people involved in thinking about and working on science diplomacy deserves to be widened to get a better grasp of the issues and the practical problems. My most important task as moderator is to keep an eye on the clock, so that's what I'm doing from time to time. And so this is we move on now to the third slot. And the third slot, I don't have my card in front of me with the names of the two speakers, but Tim Flink and Pascal Grisset have also left their mark on this field. Pascal, as a professor of modern history at Sorbonne and also directing InsSciDE, has been really helpful in putting all of this together. So thank you very much for that, Pascal. And Pascal's more from an intellectual perspective, from an academic perspective. Pascal's work as a historian looks at widening, look at wider concepts, how this could also be a perspective of innovation, could help us in understanding science diplomacy historically and also in a forward-looking sense. Tim, I would like to start with Tim from the Humboldt University in Berlin. And Tim, who has already contributed also a blog that I can strongly recommend on the website of the Hague Journal of Diplomacy. It's a perfect appetizer for this debate. Tim has been hired, so to say, to bring us a more critical perspective, which is really necessary. I take from the previous discussion that it's very important to look at what practices actually are and to start from an analysis of actual practices, but also not to forget as academics that we have a theoretical responsibility to sort of wrestle with these concepts. Tim, over to you first. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Due to the short time, I leave out all the notes of gratitude to everyone. Well, the first point I'd like to make is that I would back every single statement that has been made by PIERRE-BRUNO before, because my observation of science diplomacy is stemming from about 10 years. So the first project that we have done was in 2008 until 2009, where we did a comparative study on how 6 different countries, so we're talking about Germany, France, the UK, the United States, Switzerland, and Japan, do of what we associate with science diplomacy. So who are the ministries in charge? What are the people doing abroad? By the way, we interviewed people like PIERRE-BRUNO while he was still a practitioner. And I can only but confirm that the perspective of collaboration and tackling the grand challenges, engaging in the SDGs and being RRI, responsible research and innovation driven, is not so much what the mainstream is doing. And I had been a practitioner before, working as the assistant to the directorate of the German Research Foundation, being seconded to Brussels. And guess what this job was all about? It was all about the question, how much money is Germany getting out of the framework programs? So much for collaboration. What I figure out in recent times, and this is my critique to the discourse, is that there has been too many promises out there in the name of science diplomacy. So as I said, it's about tackling the grand societal challenges. And practitioners, as PIERRE-BRUNO said, who do not necessarily come from the diplomatic sphere or science policy or higher education policy seem to overdo and overbook expectations as to what science diplomacy can achieve. And this is the rather essayistic text that I've provided to the Hague Journal. And speaking about theory, I think it's time that we step back and ask ourselves if we are not operating too close as analytics to the concept itself. So shouldn't we rather think about, you know, analytical concepts that are worth an analysis? That is to say, science as a functional system and politics as a functional system of society. Well, we have figures that Lorenzo described as, you know, hybrid persons who try to intermediate between the two systems. Well, we have actions that try to bring together, such as funding programs or agreements, the two systems' logics, and where we have also organizations that try to bridge the two logics. I have no final answer to this, but maybe one comment to case studies that I've now seen also as part of the two huge, or I would say three large European Union consortial projects, so LCIT, S4D4C, and InsSciDE. I don't see clear-cut qualitative analysis as to the question what science diplomacy made as a difference to the interrelation between science and politics. Has it really changed the portfolio within foreign ministries? Are staff numbers rising that we call science diplomats? Do we figure that there is more funding programs within foreign ministries and other agencies that engage into what Paul and others normatively try to achieve? That is a better world, a safer world, a world that is doing its homework in terms of climate change and the like, in the name of science diplomacy. So my critic is not to be understood as scathing in the sense that I doubt the concept as such, or that I doubt people who have who believe into science diplomacy as a solution. But I think I shouldn't make it too easy for people, because it's too simplified messages that are out there. So science is not an august calling of people who have higher grounds or higher moral standards. I really doubt that, and I'm doing science and technology studies here for over 15 years. So why would that be the case? Why would people be so much more collaborative at the moment, while OLGA and other people such as PIERRE-BRUNO point to the fact that nation states are competing in a global war for talents and products and services? So it's a little bit too lightweighted and too easy to my liking, against the background that we have no substantial evidence whether science diplomacy works or not. Thank you. I think that was 5 minutes, right?
Oh, I didn't count the minutes, Tim, but I've been listening very attentively and with great interest. And as you were concluding, I was wondering myself, well, indeed, but also the frame of geopolitical rivalry has its limitations, and perhaps later for the discussion, you could come back and imagine that a student is knocking on your door and looking for an interesting thesis topic. What would you recommend? Because we're really talking here about, I think we're at this fascinating juncture of how to move the discussion on science diplomacy forward. And that's what I really like about this panel and about the contributions. And of course, in the end, we always turn to the historians who come to the rescue. So that's where I'm going to Pascal. And we've been talking about science diplomacy. Many countries would feel more comfortable with science and technology, or science and technology and innovation as terminology, and that's where the economy comes in. And so Pascal, a very stimulating and complex argument, and your challenge is here to tell us in 5 minutes what it's all about.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan and Pierre-Bruno, for having organized this very nice session. What I would like to do is very briefly underline some ideas I proposed in the paper. I will try to share my screen. I hope that this will work. Not sure. You see something? No? No, it doesn't work. Oh, it's too bad. Well, what I wanted to do in this paper was to have a look through history on the vocabulary used at present time. I've been very surprised by the fact that very recently, two main papers were using the term of innovation diplomacy. And one of them was explaining that finally innovation diplomacy was replacing science diplomacy as a new way to act in a more modern world in the 21st century. I wanted to underline that this use of technology, of innovation, was in a way an old activity in the diplomatic system used by King Louis XV, visiting the shipyards with other kings, showing the French technology. We see that this use of technology was much more efficient and organized through the action of Great Britain in the middle of the 19th century with the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. This is for me the very beginning of what we can name the innovation diplomacy. You show the technology, and through the technology, it's not only economic diplomacy. Very often, innovation diplomacy is linked to economic diplomacy, but it's also science, and it's also culture. And I show in the paper that the evolution of the World Exhibition are a good evidence that innovation diplomacy is in fact an hybrid category. It's a mix of different kind of action using science, technology, economics, but also culture. The evolution of world exhibits shows that more and more countries, and it's obvious after Second World II, used paintings, sculpture, cooking, in order to show their ability to influence the world in a way. So going to the end of the paper, I present some questions. How this kind of innovation diplomacy that we have seen in the 20th century with, for instance, the Apollo-Soyuz, or in 1937 in Paris, USSR and Nazi Germany fighting through the TV system. They were competing through the TV system. That was Pacific. It didn't remain a long time, but it was. And is it still possible in the 21st century? I agree with the analysis showing that finally the state diplomacy has to share the territory with cities, with unions, with international organization, but also with company, with business, with different kind of actors in the field of what I would call maybe material diplomacy, using different things. And what I see also since the beginning of the 21st century, this word has been used at the very beginning of our panel, is open innovation. When you enter in a world of open innovation, when innovators are sharing through very small structures or big structures their knowledge, making money with networking, is it still possible to have a flag on innovation? this question was already put on the table in the 1980s, 1990s. A company has or not a nationality. For instance, when at this time IBM was doing something in the world, was it the United States? Less and less. So the challenges of the 21st century show that globally diplomacy will have to be reorganized in order to be able to tackle very specific issues. So, and I go in the sense, in a way, of Tim, thinking that the use of science diplomacy was a kind of, not a gimmick, it's too much, but it's a branding from some practices. I'm not sure that this kind of branding will be still efficient in the future. More and more diplomacy will have to use some kind of special packaging in order to meet some specific challenges. Dealing also with different actors. So we have to imagine the words we were using in a very recent past, and we are still using in a way, like economic diplomacy, culture diplomacy, and so on, like some Lego. These small pieces that we will use in order to build a global diplomacy much more connected to present time challenges.
Thank you very much, Pascal, for that. And well, there are many sides to your argument, including the formidable organizational challenges ahead. That's where I would like to call in Lorenzo again. And perhaps, Lorenzo, can I tempt you to comment on this point of the organizational challenges? What would be your take on that? And perhaps also Karen would like to come in there. So please, either of you, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Jan. Yeah, I'd like to comment on something that Pascal has mentioned, the need to restructure global diplomacy and such. And actually, in my piece of what is a science diplomat, I refer to tech ambassadors as an innovative practice that is undertaken by certain countries, such as France, Denmark, or Bolivia, to send specific ambassadors or diplomats to not to foreign capital cities of a foreign country, but to clusters of innovations, such as Silicon Valley or Boston or other places, to liaise directly between nation states and companies and big tech and startups and such. And I think that's a very interesting way of undertaking diplomacy beyond the usual framework. Jan, I cannot hear you.
I'm sorry, my mic was off. I was saying we see already examples of that are interesting and recent, like Denmark's tech ambassador in Silicon Valley, or the quite well documented case of SwissNex. But of course, also the houses in Spain are examples of public-private collaboration that are really interesting. Karen, could I invite you to come in on this one as well?
Absolutely, yeah. I thought that was a great answer from Lorenzo, and really I think sort of highlights sort of the much broader use of science for diplomacy around the world, especially places where, you know, maybe things are quite decentralized, and so you have these, you know, institutions, whether they're academic or industry or think tanks, where they have quite a bit of freedom and can sort of use science as a pathway for connecting and building those relationships, especially in these crazy times of the pandemic, when there's just so many different components that are involved here.
Thank you very much, Karen. The manual hands up works. Pascal, I noticed your hand.
Yes, I completely agree with these comments. I would like to add one thing. I was surprised that I'm working about diplomacy for a few years. Finally, I was much more connected to companies, economic history. But what I thought is a kind of a very strict hierarchy between what it's still named diplomacy in an embassy. You have the the classical diplomacy. And then you have in other part of the building, economic diplomacy, science diplomacy, agriculture diplomacy, things like that. So there is still, and maybe Pierre-Bruno will comment on that, a kind of hierarchy between people, the real diplomats. And a real diplomat is not at all doing something diplomacy, is doing diplomacy, and he is using people helping him to organize the big diplomacy. So this kind of hierarchy is, I think, a little bit old-fashioned, and the new organization will have to deal with that.
Thank you, Pascal. If Karen and Paul could be very brief, and then I would like to turn to the audience also, and to Daniela Palmberg, who is looking at the questions in the chat. So Karen, please keep it brief.
Yeah, I just wanted to put out the phrase boundary spanning, because I think we used it in our article, and I think that really fits in with what Pascal said, of this sort of this many people being involved, and nobody may be an expert in everything, but know enough that they can communicate across these different boundaries.
Definitely, yeah. Thanks for again mentioning that concept, which I also find very appealing and fundamental when we see diplomacy as a networked practice, also with many different levels of governance and different types of actors coming in, as you also mentioned before. Paul, I'm moving on the screen from Paul to Tim. Paul, please, so again. I'm sorry to be now. I'm a nasty chair. Please keep it brief.
I wanted to agree completely with Tim and with Pascal. The concept of science diplomacy itself is too simplified, and it is branding. It had a utility for the first 10 years to bring it into the foreign ministries. And I can only speak from personal experience. As a science diplomat, convening the first formal dialogue between NATO and Russia regarding security in the Arctic. Now, the question is, how does science diplomacy operate? And the observation comes from a meeting with the Foreign Minister Science and Technology Advisory Network and the International Network of Government Science Advice, which identified this notion of a continuum of urgencies. Informed decision-making is a process. Science diplomacy operates as a process, and the process leads to informed decisions as the apex goal. Being able to train that process, the skills, the methods, and the theory goes to the heart of what Karen said in terms of education. And it starts with K through 12, research in universities, and leadership into professions.
Thank you very much, Paul, and also for making that point that the branding was functional, was important. The question is how to move on, and that's where Tim, are you still with us? I saw your hand raised, is that correct?
Yes, my video was partly freeze. I just wanted to comment on Lorenzo. I think the well, we interview people such as from Denmark or from Swissnex or the German science and innovation houses all around the world. And whether this is a very good example of a science diplomat working on collaborative and normative idealistic manners on science is what I doubt, because most of the time these people are trying to sell collaborations and get foreign direct investment back into their country. So it's rather on the competitive side that these are working. Whether this has spillover effects such as branding and positive imaging of science, technology, and innovation is on a different page, I would say. But otherwise, I don't know if these are the best examples of science diplomats.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. I would like to invite Daniela Palmberg to come on the screen or to join the conversation with questions from other people who are joining in and are not on the panel. So Daniela, over to you.
Sure. I will present a couple of questions that have come in. I'll start with one from Rasmus, who was to the panel in general, but maybe particular to Lorenzo. He asked, what is the role of particularly strong transnational and diaspora relations in science diplomacy? So Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Iceland could be examples of such particularly strong transnational or diaspora relations. I'll go ahead and also present a question about COVID-19 and and the pandemic's impact on science diplomacy. Vera Sabatini asked us what has if the pandemic has perhaps changed our perception of science diplomacy and what the practice can do, as well as what can science diplomacy teach us about the pandemic. And I will go ahead and just put one more question out there in case we have time for that as well. And that came from Thierry in the chat, who also asked shouldn't science diplomacy have a further reach than the most commonly used frameworks of nations, considering that scientists are not as tied to nations as other actors, perhaps to the more critical voices in the group.
Okay, could we start with the last question? Is there any volunteer to take up this final final question? Yes, Olga. Yeah.
Jan, of course, you know, it's a couple of years ago, my monograph was devoted to national styles in diplomacy, in science and science diplomacy. So I convinced to say that, of course, science, it's a universal category, but at the same time, we see differences at the national level. So we cannot ignore this fact. And yes, these approaches, national approaches, so we definitely can see them in science. And of course, just moving further to this, we see science diplomacy approaches, they differentiated from country to country, and understanding of this concept as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Olga. Then before the big question, over to Lorenzo on diaspora relations. There is a burgeoning literature on diaspora relations, and we see indeed the importance of diaspora in international relations in different manifestations. So in science diplomacy, what comes to your mind here?
Yeah, in science diplomacy, global diasporas are playing a role as learned societies, or even as individuals that may ease collaborations or competition approaches between different countries. It's important because they can connect or engage a destination country with their home countries. And perhaps, I mean, we can see other learned societies, such as the Royal Society or the AAAS, who have played a predominant role in science diplomacy. They are not meant to be state actors, but they have helped in shaping the science diplomacy global discourse. So global diasporas may play this role as well. I would also like to comment on Tim's comment regarding whether the innovation ambassadors would be representative of science diplomacy or not. Well, in my definition of science diplomats, I'm not talking about these people as only and uniquely addressing global challenges. I think science diplomacy is a wide concept that goes for national interest, for competition, for collaboration, for addressing global challenges and such. And therefore, certainly these tech ambassadors are more prone to technology and innovation diplomacy and competition than collaboration. But still, I phrase them within the big umbrella term of science diplomacy.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorenzo. I'm conscious of the fact that we are part of a larger whole, and that by in a couple of minutes we will be cut off from the program. So may I be so cheeky, PIERRE-BRUNO, to the other question on how COVID-19 has changed perceptions of science diplomacy, and how COVID-19 could inform science diplomacy practices, if I got the complete question right, for you to deal with that. And could I just mention that the next forum in the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, which will be online at the end of October, is actually on diplomacy after COVID-19, with 13 essays, kept us busy during the summer. So PIERRE-BRUNO, what's your take on this one?
Well, can you hear me? Yes?
Sure, we can, yeah.
This is the big question for the last minute, you see, so it's so difficult to speak about that. Well, when I mentioned it in the talk that the COVID-19 was a stress test for science diplomacy, I had in mind that science diplomacy is supposed to have its greatest relevance in order to address global challenges. And I think that Paul will agree with that. But what we have seen, you know, in the weeks following the starting, the emergence of the pandemic, we have spoken about science, of course, between countries, exchanging data between different teams on the international sphere, but we haven't heard about diplomacy, you see. Science was there and trying to find responses, but diplomacy was not there because governments were, you know, very busy with national issues, how to take care of their populations. So far, what we miss, you know, is real coordination between states, a real role to the World Health Organization, sorry. And what we need is multilateralism. What we need is multilateral diplomacy. And still, we do not have such multilateral diplomacy as far as the COVID-19 is concerned. So we are on our way to build a true response to the global pandemics through science diplomacy. But so far, in my opinion, science diplomacy didn't put forward the good answer.
Thank you very much, PIERRE-BRUNO, for in fact wrapping things up like this. I'm not quite sure whether the connection will just be discontinued at a certain point. So please allow me to wrap up very briefly and thank all of you for your contributions of what I thought was a very spirited discussion, very stimulating discussion, and that which was the intention also to help us think on how to move this debate forward, which I think is a responsibility, not a heavy one, but an exciting one, which is a responsibility for all of us to take the debate forward. And COVID-19 has sort of accelerated that. So thank you so much also for people outside who are listening in. And I hope that you will be inspired by what you've heard to continue your work in this field and also to contribute to academic thinking and more think tank work on science diplomacy. Thanks very much to Daniela and UNESCO for being here, making this possible. Certainly without your help we would have been nowhere. It seems also simple, but it comes together very nicely. Thanks to Pascal for picking up swiftly that suggestion that I made in a moment to, well, let's have a webinar. Now we are so all inundated with webinars, as I could hardly imagine when I proposed this. There are rather too many webinars, and I think we, all of us, have to be increasingly selective and decide whether we want to be in yet another discussion on the web. But this has been hugely stimulating. And for me, in this journey, everything's going back to PIERRE-BRUNO. So thank you for indeed doing this, putting together this list of people and taking that to the final goal with me of a forum discussion, which I see very much as an ongoing thing. Now, what I like to see as editor-in-chief of the Hague Journal of Diplomacy is future articles where you can indeed see how people build on what was said in this debate. And I'm very sure that there are new generations of researchers. They're very ready to do just that. So thank you very much to all of you. And I'm afraid that on the internet, you draw these things to a close by pushing the leave button. So I'm inviting you to do that. And I'm just going to wait and see what happens. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Stay healthy.